The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering that practically screamed expensive. Rachel Davis and Derek Thompson request the pleasure of your company at their engagement celebration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The date hit me like a physical blow. Exactly 8 months to the day since Derek had walked out of our house with 2 suitcases and a confession that shattered my world. My best friend since college, the woman who had been my maid of honor, was now marrying my ex-husband, and they wanted me to celebrate with them. I should have thrown the invitation in the trash. Any rational person would have. But as I held that pristine piece of paper in my trembling hands, something cold and calculating settled in my chest. They wanted me there for a reason, and it wasn't out of friendship or guilt. This was Rachel's victory lap, her final humiliation, and she expected me to show up broken and defeated. What she didn't know was that I had spent the last 8 months doing more than just healing from their betrayal. I had been watching, learning, and most importantly, discovering secrets that could destroy the perfect image they had so carefully constructed. The morning Derek left me started like any other Tuesday, except it was our 5th wedding anniversary. I had taken the day off work, planning to surprise him with dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date. I spent hours preparing, choosing the perfect dress. The one he had always said made my eyes look like emeralds. When he came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room with champagne chilled and his favorite playlist softly filling the space. He didn't even look at the candles I had lit or notice the effort I had put into everything. Instead, he stood in our doorway like a stranger, his face carrying an expression I had never seen before. Cold, distant, and somehow relieved. The words came out in a rush, as if he had rehearsed them but wanted to get through them quickly. He was leaving. He had been unhappy for months. He needed space to figure things out. The usual script of a man who had already made his decision but wanted to soften the blow with vague explanations. But then came the part that changed everything. As he headed toward our bedroom to pack, I asked the question that any wife would ask in that moment. Was there someone else? The pause that followed stretched between us like a chasm. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. Rachel. My Rachel. The woman who had held my hand through my mother's funeral, who had helped me pick out my wedding dress, who had been the first person I called when I got promoted at work. She had been there through every milestone of my adult life, and now she was the reason my marriage was ending. The betrayal cut deeper than I had thought possible. It wasn't just that my husband was leaving me, it was that my best friend had been lying to my face for months, maybe longer. All those girls' nights when she had listened to me complain about Derek working late, all those times she had offered advice about our relationship, all those moments when she had looked me in the eyes and asked how things were going with him. She had known exactly how things were going because she was the reason they were falling apart. In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece together the timeline. When had it started? How long had they been meeting behind my back? The questions consumed me, but the answers were always just out of reach. Derek moved out that same night, and within days, Rachel had stopped returning my calls. The woman who had been my closest confidant for over a decade simply vanished from my life, leaving behind only the ghost of a friendship I now realized had been built on lies. The divorce proceedings were swift and clinical. Derek wanted out fast, and he was willing to give me almost everything to make it happen. The house, most of our savings, even his grandmother's jewelry that I had always admired, he handed it. All over without a fight. At the time, I thought it was guilt driving his generosity, but now I understand it was something else entirely. He wanted a clean slate, no messy entanglements that might complicate his new life with Rachel. Every signature on those legal documents was him buying his freedom from our shared history. Rachel, meanwhile, had transformed into someone I barely recognized. The casual, down-to-earth woman I had known was gone, replaced by a polished version of herself that seemed to glow with newfound confidence. Her social media became a carefully curated gallery of happiness, professional photos of her and Derek at wine tastings, romantic getaways to places we had talked about visiting together, and countless images of the engagement ring that had appeared on her finger just 4 months after my divorce was finalized. But social media only told part of the story, and I had learned to read between the lines. My work in marketing had taught me how to analyze an image, how to spot the things people tried to hide behind perfect lighting and strategic angles. In Rachel's photos, I began to notice details that others might miss. The way Derek's smile never quite reached his eyes. How Rachel's hand was always positioned to show off her ring, even in the most casual shots. The forced quality of their laughter in videos, as if they were performing happiness rather than living it. It was during one of my late-night scrolling sessions that I stumbled across something interesting. A comment on one of Rachel's posts from someone named Ashley Morgan, congratulating her on the engagement and mentioning how excited the whole family was about the upcoming party. Ashley Morgan, Rachel's younger sister, who had always been the black sheep of the Davis family. I remembered Rachel mentioning her over the years, usually in the context of some family drama or disappointment. Ashley was the artistic one, the one who had dropped out of law school to pursue photography, the one who never quite lived up to their parents' expectations. On impulse, I clicked on Ashley's profile. Unlike Rachel's perfectly curated feed, Ashley's Instagram was raw and unfiltered. Real moments, genuine emotions, and most importantly, unguarded posts about family dynamics that painted a very different picture of the Davis household than the one Rachel typically presented. There were subtle complaints about family pressure, cryptic posts about authenticity versus performance, and, most intriguingly, recent photos from family gatherings where Rachel and Derek were notably absent or positioned awkwardly apart from the rest of the group. I spent hours going through Ashley's posts, not out of obsession, but out of genuine curiosity about the cracks in Rachel's perfect facade. What I discovered was fascinating. The Davis family was known in Portland's social circles for their wealth and influence. Rachel's father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and her mother was heavily involved in charity work that kept the family name in the society pages. But Ashley's posts revealed the pressure that came with that lifestyle, the expectations and the cost of maintaining appearances. One post in particular caught my attention. It was a throwback photo from Rachel's college graduation, showing our entire friend group from those days. The caption was seemingly innocent, but something about it felt loaded with meaning. Some people never change, and others change so much you don't recognize them anymore. Grateful for the ones who stayed, true to themselves. The photo had been posted just 2 weeks after Rachel and Derek's engagement announcement. I began to wonder if Ashley might be more of an ally than I had initially thought. Rachel had always described her sister as unpredictable and difficult, someone who stirred up trouble within the family. But what if Ashley simply refused to play the same games that everyone else did? What if she saw through the performance in a way that others didn't? The idea began to take shape slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. If I was going to attend this engagement party, and I was becoming more certain that I would, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was walking into. Rachel's family dynamics, Derek's new position within that family structure, and most importantly, who else might be harboring doubts about this picture-perfect romance they were presenting to the world. I started reaching out to old mutual friends, not to gossip or complain, but to gauge their reactions to the engagement. The conversations were revealing in their careful neutrality. Lisa Parker, who had been part of our college friend group, was particularly interesting to talk to. She had always been the diplomatic one, the peacekeeper who tried to see all sides of every situation. But when I mentioned Rachel and Derek's engagement, there was a pause that spoke volumes. "It's just so fast," Lisa finally said, and I could hear the conflict in her voice. "I mean, I know people process things differently. but sometimes I wonder if they really thought through what this means for everyone involved. She didn't say my name, but we both knew who she meant by everyone involved. These conversations gave me hope that I wasn't alone in questioning the narrative that Rachel and Derek were presenting. Their whirlwind romance might look perfect from the outside, but the people who knew us all could see the complicated truth underneath. The problem was that most people were too polite or too uncomfortable to say anything directly. As the engagement party date approached, I found myself in an interesting position. I could attend and play the role of the gracious ex-wife, offering my congratulations and blessing to the happy couple. I could stay home and let them have their perfect night without the awkwardness of my presence. Or I could do something else. Entirely. Something that would force everyone to confront the truth they were all pretending not to see. The decision crystallized one evening when I was going through old photo albums, something I had been avoiding for months. There, tucked between pictures of happier times, I found a letter Rachel had written me during our senior year of college. She had been going through a rough patch with a boyfriend who had been cheating on her, and she was devastated by the betrayal. In her careful handwriting, she had poured out her feelings about trust, loyalty, and what it meant to truly know someone. The worst part isn't even the cheating, she had written. It's the lying. It's looking someone in the face and pretending to be something you're not. It's making someone believe in a version of you that doesn't exist. I don't know how people live with themselves when they do that to someone who loves them. The irony was almost too perfect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rachel had written those words with such conviction, such moral clarity about the very thing she had ended up doing to me. The woman who had comforted me through every heartbreak had become the source of my greatest one, and she had done it with the same lies and deception she had once condemned. That night, I made my decision. I would attend the engagement party, but not as the victim they expected me to be. I would go armed with knowledge, with allies I hadn't yet fully cultivated, and with a plan that would give everyone exactly what they claimed to want: the truth. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 more days before I finally picked up my phone and called the number listed for RSVPs. Rachel's mother answered, her voice as polished and gracious as always. She seemed genuinely surprised to hear from me, and I could detect a note of uncertainty as she confirmed my attendance for the party. "Claire, dear," she said, and I could practically hear her measuring her words. "I hope you know how much this means to Rachel that you're choosing to be there. She's been worried about how you're handling everything." The concern in her voice sounded genuine, but I knew better than to trust it completely. The Davis family was skilled at saying the right things, at maintaining the appearance of caring while protecting their own interests. Still, I played my part perfectly, assuring her that I only wanted Rachel to be happy and that I was looking forward to celebrating this new chapter in her life. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the real game was just beginning. Rachel thought she knew me, the heartbroken ex-wife who would either stay away in shame or show up to offer her tearful blessing. But the woman she had betrayed was not the same person who had lit candles for her cheating husband 8 months ago. I had learned to read between the lines, to see the cracks in carefully constructed facades, and most importantly, to understand that sometimes the truth needed a little help to come to light. The grand ballroom at Riverside Manor was booked for a Saturday evening in October, exactly 8 months after the anniversary that had changed everything. I marked the date on my calendar and began to plan not just what I would wear, but who I would become for that one crucial night. The engagement party would be Rachel's moment of triumph, but I was determined to make sure it was also the moment when everyone finally saw her for who she really was. The week before the engagement party, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went shopping. Not the mindless browsing I had been doing to fill empty hours, but deliberate, strategic shopping. I needed to look perfect, not in the way that screamed desperation or trying too hard, but in the way that suggested I was thriving, Success was the best revenge, they said, and I intended to embody that completely. I chose a deep navy dress that hugged my figure in all the right places, elegant but not flashy, expensive but not ostentatious. The kind of dress that would make people look twice and wonder where I had been hiding such confidence. I paired it with jewelry Derek had never seen, pieces I had bought for myself in the months after he left, small acts of defiance that had slowly rebuilt my sense of self-worth. But the real preparation wasn't about clothes or appearances, it was about information, and I had been gathering it methodically for weeks. Ashley Morgan had become an unexpected source of insight into the Davis family dynamics, though she didn't know it yet. Her social media posts painted a picture of a family that looked perfect from the outside, but struggled with the pressure of maintaining that image. More importantly, her recent posts had revealed something interesting about Rachel's behavior in the months leading up to the engagement. According to Ashley's casual observations, Rachel had been increasingly anxious about family gatherings, often arriving late or leaving early with Derek in tow. There were mentions of heated phone calls that ended abruptly when others entered the room, and references to Rachel being stressed about work, even though she had always thrived under pressure before. The portrait that emerged was of someone who was working very hard to keep something hidden, even from her own family. I had also been paying attention to Derek's patterns, not out of lingering attachment, but out of curiosity about how he was adjusting to his new life. His LinkedIn profile showed that he had been promoted at work, something I learned not from him, but from a mutual colleague who mentioned it in passing. The promotion had come just 3 months after our divorce was finalized, which struck me as remarkably convenient timing. Derek had always been competent at his job, but he had never been the type to aggressively pursue advancement. Yet suddenly he was climbing the corporate ladder at a pace that seemed almost too good to be true. The more I dug into the details of their new life together, the more questions arose. Rachel had moved into a downtown apartment that was, well, beyond what her salary as a marketing coordinator could afford, even with Derek contributing to the rent. Her Instagram showed regular dinners at expensive restaurants, weekend trips to wine country, and a wardrobe that had clearly been upgraded significantly in recent months. Either Derek was spending money he didn't have, or there was another source of income that wasn't immediately obvious. My background in marketing had taught me to look for inconsistencies in the stories people told, and Rachel's story had several gaps that didn't quite make sense. She claimed to be happier than she had ever been, but her social media presence felt performative in a way it never had before. The candid moments that had always made her posts feel authentic were gone, replaced by carefully staged photos that looked more like advertisements for a lifestyle than genuine glimpses into her life. It was while analyzing one of these posts that I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. In the background of a photo Rachel had posted from a restaurant, I could see Derek's phone lying face up on the table. The screen was lit with what appeared to be a text message, and while I couldn't read the content, I could see enough to notice that the contact name started with an initial that wasn't R. It was a small detail, the kind of thing most people would never notice, but it suggested that Derek might be in communication with someone Rachel didn't know about. The discovery made me wonder what other secrets might be hiding beneath the surface of their relationship. If Derek was capable of betraying me so completely, what made Rachel think she was immune to the same treatment? More importantly, if there were cracks in their relationship already, how much pressure would it take to widen them into something that couldn't be ignored? I decided to test a theory. Using a fake social media account I had created months earlier for research purposes, I began engaging with Ashley's posts in small ways, liking photos, leaving occasional comments that were supportive but not too familiar. Nothing that would raise suspicion, but enough to establish a digital presence that felt real. After a few weeks of this subtle interaction, I took the next step and sent her a direct message. The message was carefully crafted to seem like it came from someone who had mutual friends with the family but didn't know the full story of recent events. I mentioned seeing her photos from family gatherings and complimented her photography skills, then casually mentioned that I had heard her sister was engaged and wondered if she was excited about gaining a new brother-in-law. It was an innocent enough question, but one that gave Ashley an opening to share her real feelings if she was inclined to do so. Her response came back within hours, and it was more revealing than I had hoped. Ashley thanked me for the compliment on her photography, and then launched into a surprisingly honest assessment of the engagement. She was happy for Rachel, she said, but admitted that the whole situation felt rushed and complicated. She mentioned that the family had been surprised by how quickly things had moved, and that there were still some awkward conversations happening about how to handle the circumstances of how Derek and Rachel had gotten together. The phrase, awkward conversations, was particularly interesting. It suggested that even Rachel's own family was uncomfortable with the way the relationship had begun, which meant they knew more about the timeline than Rachel might have wanted them to. If the Davis family was already questioning the foundation of the relationship, it wouldn't take much to turn those private doubts into something more public. Ashley's message also revealed something else that I found intriguing. She mentioned that Derek seemed nice enough, but that he was clearly still adjusting to the family dynamics. He was trying hard to fit in, maybe too hard, and sometimes his efforts came across as forced rather than genuine. This suggested that Derek was feeling pressure to prove himself worthy of the Davis family's acceptance, which could be a vulnerability I could exploit. I spent the next few days crafting a careful response that would deepen my connection with Ashley without revealing my true identity. I shared some observations about family dynamics in general, mentioning how difficult it could be when someone new joined a close-knit family, especially under complicated circumstances. I asked thoughtful questions about her photography work and showed genuine interest in her perspective on family relationships. Ashley's responses grew more open and detailed with each exchange. She revealed that she was often the one family member who noticed things that others preferred to ignore, and that this sometimes put her in an uncomfortable position during family gatherings. She had always been close to Rachel despite their differences, but lately she felt like her sister was becoming someone she didn't recognize. The breakthrough came when Ashley mentioned that she was dreading the engagement party because she knew it would involve a lot of pretending that everything was perfect when it clearly wasn't. She was worried about having to make small talk with people who were asking questions she didn't know how to answer, particularly about how Derek and Rachel had met and fallen in love. The family had settled on a vague story about them connecting through mutual friends, but Ashley clearly knew there was more to it than that. This was exactly the opening I needed. I expressed sympathy for her position and shared some general thoughts about how complicated family gatherings could be when there were unspoken tensions. Then, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned that I might actually be attending the engagement party myself, as I had some connection to the situation that I wasn't entirely comfortable discussing online. Ashley's response was immediate and intrigued. She wanted to know more about my connection to Derek and Rachel, and I could sense that she was hoping to find someone who shared her discomfort with the situation. I explained that I preferred to discuss it in person rather than through messages, and suggested that perhaps we could connect at the party itself. The suggestion seemed to relieve some of Ashley's anxiety about the event. She said it would be nice to have someone there who understood that the whole situation was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. We agreed to find each other at the party, and she even offered to introduce me to some other family members who might be interested in having honest conversations about the engagement. As the date of the party approached, I realized that I had accomplished something I hadn't expected. I had created an ally within Rachel's own family. Ashley might not know my true identity yet, but she was already positioned to help me reveal the truth about her sister's relationship. More importantly, she was motivated by her own frustrations with the family's tendency to prioritize appearances over authenticity. The night before the engagement party, I received one final message from Ashley that confirmed my suspicions about the cracks in Rachel and Derek's relationship. She mentioned that there had been some drama at a family dinner, the previous week, involving a phone call that Derek had taken during the meal. He had stepped outside to answer it, claiming it was work-related, but the call had lasted nearly 20 minutes, and he had seemed agitated when he returned. Rachel had tried to brush off the incident, but Ashley noticed that she seemed embarrassed and angry about Derek's behavior. There had been a tense conversation between them after dinner, with Rachel insisting that Derek needed to be more present during family time, and Derek defending his right to handle work emergencies when they arose. The argument had ended with them leaving separately, Rachel with her parents and Derek driving off alone. The incident painted a picture of a couple who were already struggling with fundamental issues about priorities and respect. If Derek was taking mysterious phone calls during family dinners and leaving his fiancée to make excuses for his behavior, their relationship was far from the perfect partnership they were presenting to the world. I spent that final evening preparing mentally for what was to come. I reviewed everything I had learned about the Davis family dynamics, Derek's recent behavior patterns, and the inconsistencies in Rachel's public persona. I thought about the conversations I might have, and the reactions I hoped to provoke. Most importantly, I reminded myself that my goal wasn't simply revenge, it was truth. Rachel and Derek had built their relationship on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and they were asking everyone in their lives to celebrate and validate those choices. The engagement party was their attempt to legitimize what they had done, by surrounding themselves with the approval of family and friends. But approval based on deception wasn't really approval at all, and I was determined to give everyone the information they needed to make an informed decision about what they were really celebrating. As I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and was struck by how different I looked from the woman who had waited with champagne and candles 8 months earlier. The change wasn't just physical, though I was undeniably healthier and more confident than I had been during the final months of my marriage. The real change was in my eyes. There was a sharpness there now, a clarity that came from understanding exactly who I was dealing with and what I was capable of doing about it. Tomorrow would be Rachel's big night, her moment to show the world how perfectly everything had worked out. She would be surrounded by family and friends, wearing a beautiful dress and an expensive ring, celebrating her engagement to the man she had stolen from me. She expected me to be there as a symbol of her complete victory, the defeated ex-wife offering her gracious blessing to their happiness. What she didn't expect was that I had spent 8 months learning how to see through the performance, how to find the weak spots in even the most carefully constructed facade. She certainly didn't expect that I had found allies within her own family who were questioning the very narrative she was trying to sell. The engagement party would be Rachel's stage, but I was prepared to change the script entirely. By the time the evening was over, everyone would understand exactly what kind of love story they were really celebrating, and Rachel would learn that some victories come with a price she hadn't considered. I set my alarm for early the next morning and tried to get some sleep, though my mind was already racing through the possibilities of what tomorrow might bring. The woman who had once believed in fairy tale endings was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most satisfying stories were the ones where the truth finally came to light, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be, for everyone involved. The grand ballroom at Riverside Manor was exactly what I had expected: opulent, tasteful, and designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in ivory linens, each centerpiece a carefully arranged bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus. The bar was positioned strategically at one end of the room, ensuring guests would have to mingle as they moved between drinks and conversation. Everything was perfect, just as Rachel had always demanded her events to be. I arrived precisely at 7:30, fashionably late, but not so late as to make an entrance that would draw unwanted attention. The valet took my keys with professional efficiency, and as I walked through the manor's elegant lobby, I could hear the gentle hum of conversation and laughter drifting from the ballroom. The sound should have made me nervous, but instead I felt remarkably calm. 8 months of preparation had led to this moment, and I was ready. The first person I saw was Derek's mother, Linda, who had always been kind to me during our marriage. She was standing near the entrance greeting guests, and her face lit up with genuine surprise when she spotted me. The warm hug she gave me felt real, untainted by the awkwardness that seemed to surround most people when they encountered the ex-wife at events like this. "Claire, honey, I'm so glad you came," she said, holding my hands as she studied my face. "You look absolutely radiant. How have you been?" There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the evening's celebration, either. Linda had always been perceptive, and I suspected she had her own questions about how quickly Derek had moved from our marriage into this engagement. Her warmth toward me felt like a small act of rebellion against the narrative that everyone was expected to embrace. "I'm doing well, Linda. Really well, actually," I replied, and I could see her relief at my apparent composure. "I wanted to be here to support Derek's happiness." The words were carefully chosen, and Linda seemed to catch the subtle distinction between supporting Derek and supporting the relationship itself. She squeezed my hands once more before releasing them, and I could see in her eyes that she understood more about the situation than she was willing to say aloud. As I moved deeper into the room, I spotted Rachel almost immediately. She was holding court near the far wall, surrounded by a cluster of her colleagues and college friends, all admiring her ring and listening to what appeared to be the story of Derek's proposal. She looked stunning, as I had known she would. Her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, wearing a flowing champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But something was off about her demeanor. Despite being surrounded by well-wishers and compliments, there was a tightness around her eyes that I recognized from our years of friendship. It was the expression she wore when she was working too. Hard to maintain control of a situation when she was performing happiness rather than experiencing it genuinely. Derek stood beside her, one hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that looked possessive rather than affectionate. He was smiling and nodding at the appropriate moments, but I could see the strain in his posture. This was not a man, basking in the glow of newfound love. This was someone playing a role he wasn't entirely comfortable with. I moved toward the bar, taking my time to observe the room's dynamics. The guest list was a fascinating mix of Rachel's family, Derek's family, mutual friends from our college days, and what appeared to be a significant number of Rachel's work colleagues and social connections. The division was subtle but noticeable. Derek's people seemed slightly subdued, while Rachel's crowd was more animated, more invested in the celebration. It was while waiting for my wine that I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned to find a young woman with kind eyes and an uncertain smile, someone I recognized from Ashley's Instagram photos, but had never met in person. "Excuse me, are you Claire?" she asked quietly, glancing around as if making sure we weren't overheard. I nodded, extending my hand. "You must be Ashley. It's so nice to finally meet you in person." Her handshake was firm, and I could see the intelligence in her eyes that had come through in our online conversations. Up close, she looked even less like Rachel than I had expected. Where Rachel was polished and controlled, Ashley had an authentic warmth that couldn't be manufactured. "I have to admit, I'm curious about your connection to all this," Ashley said, her voice low enough that our conversation wouldn't carry to nearby guests. "You mentioned it was complicated." I took a sip of my wine, considering how much to reveal and how quickly. Ashley had been honest with me about her discomfort with the engagement, and I sensed that she was ready to hear some difficult truths. "I used to be married to Derek," I said simply, watching her face for her reaction. Ashley's eyes widened, and she took a small step back. "You're the ex-wife," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. "Rachel's former best friend." The fact that she knew about our friendship told me that the Davis family was more aware of the complicated history than they had let on publicly. Ashley studied my face with new interest, and I could see her mental gears turning as she processed this information. "So, you're here because—" She trailed off, clearly not sure how to finish the question. "I'm here because I was invited," I said truthfully. "And because I think there are some things about this relationship that people should know before they celebrate it too enthusiastically." Ashley glanced toward where Rachel was still entertaining her admirers, then back at me. "What kind of things?" Before I could answer, we were interrupted by the arrival of Kevin Davis, Rachel's older brother. I recognized him from family photos Rachel had shown me over the years, though he looked more serious in person than he had in those casual snapshots. "Ashley, there you are," he said, then noticed me and extended his hand politely. "I don't think we've met. I'm Kevin, Rachel's brother." "Claire Thompson," I replied, shaking his hand and watching his expression carefully. The recognition was immediate, and Kevin's demeanor shifted subtly. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was a wariness in his eyes that suggested he had been briefed on who I was and why my presence might be significant. "Well," he said after a moment, "this is certainly an interesting development." Ashley looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "Kevin, did you know that Claire and Rachel used to be best friends?" Kevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was aware of their history, yes." The careful way he phrased his response told me that the Davis family had discussed my potential attendance at the party, and probably my relationship with Rachel in general. They knew more about the situation than they were comfortable acknowledging, publicly. "I hope my being here isn't causing any problems," I said, keeping my tone light but watching Kevin's reaction carefully. "Not at all," he replied, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We want everyone to feel welcome." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone tapping a knife against a champagne glass. The room gradually quieted as attention turned toward the front, where Rachel's father, Robert Davis, was preparing to make a toast. He was an imposing man even in his 60s, with the kind of commanding presence that came from years of running successful businesses and expecting people to listen when he spoke. "Friends and family," Robert began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Margaret and I are delighted that you're here tonight to celebrate Rachel and Derek's engagement." The applause was polite but subdued, and I noticed that several people seemed to be looking around the room rather than focusing entirely on the speaker. There was an undercurrent of tension that even Robert's practiced charm couldn't completely mask. "As most of you know," Robert continued, "Rachel has always been someone who knows what she wants and goes after it with determination. We're thrilled that she's found someone who shares her ambitions and her vision for the future." The phrasing was interesting. He was praising Rachel's determination while subtly acknowledging that she had gone after Derek. It wasn't quite an admission of how the relationship had begun, but it was closer to the truth than the sanitized version they had been telling publicly. "Derek," Robert said, turning toward his future son-in-law, "we welcome you into our family and look forward to watching your partnership with Rachel flourish." Derek raised his glass and nodded, but I noticed that his smile seemed forced. There was something about the way Robert had emphasized the word partnership that suggested this was as much a business arrangement as a romantic relationship. As the toast concluded and conversations resumed, I found myself standing with Ashley and Kevin in an increasingly awkward silence. Ashley was clearly processing what she had learned about my identity, while Kevin seemed to be calculating how much damage my presence might do to the evening's carefully orchestrated celebration. "I should probably go say hello to Rachel," I said finally, breaking the tension. Ashley's eyes widened. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Kevin looked like he wanted to object as well, but seemed to realize that trying to control my movements would only draw more attention to the situation. "She invited me," I reminded them both. It would be rude not to acknowledge the guest of honor. I left them standing by the bar and made my way across the room toward where Rachel was still surrounded by her admirers. As I approached, several people in the group noticed me, and their conversations gradually died away. Rachel, sensing the change in atmosphere around her, turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. The moment our eyes met, I saw a flash of genuine emotion cross her face: surprise, fear, and something that might have been guilt. But the expression was gone so quickly that I might have imagined it, replaced by the practiced smile she had been wearing all evening. "Claire," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding group to hear, "I'm so glad you could make it." She stepped forward and embraced me, a gesture that looked warm and spontaneous to anyone watching, but felt stiff and calculated up close. I could feel the tension in her body as she hugged me, and when she pulled back, her smile was brilliant, but her eyes were wary. "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "You look absolutely beautiful tonight." The compliment was genuine. Rachel did look beautiful, even if that beauty was armor for whatever insecurities she was hiding beneath. Around us, the small crowd was watching our interaction with obvious fascination, clearly aware that this was a moment fraught with potential drama. "Thank you," Rachel replied, then turned to include Derek in the conversation. "Derek, you remember Claire, of course." Derek stepped forward, and I could see the discomfort written across his features. This was probably the last conversation he had wanted to have tonight, but there was no graceful way to avoid it. "Claire," he said, offering his hand in a gesture that was more formal than friendly. "Thank you for coming." His hand was slightly damp when I shook it, and I could see a muscle jumping in his jaw. Whatever composure he had been maintaining for the evening was being tested by my presence. "I wouldn't have missed it," I replied, letting my gaze move between them. "It's so wonderful to see you both looking so happy." The word "both" carried just enough emphasis to suggest that I was evaluating their happiness rather than simply acknowledging it. Around us, people were beginning to drift away, sensing that this conversation might venture into territory they didn't want to witness. Rachel's grip on Derek's arm tightened, and I noticed that her knuckles were white where she held on to him. "We really are," she said, her voice carrying a note of defiance. "Everything worked out exactly as it was meant to." The statement was clearly directed at me, a declaration that she felt no guilt or regret about how their relationship had begun. But the fact that she felt the need to make such a declaration suggested that she was far from at peace with her choices. "I'm sure it did," I replied evenly. "Things have a way of working out for the best, don't they?" Derek cleared his throat, clearly wanting to end the conversation before it went any further. "We should probably mingle with some of the other guests," he said to Rachel. But before they could escape, Ashley appeared at my elbow, her timing either coincidental or perfectly calculated. "Rachel," she said brightly, "I was just talking to Claire about photography. She mentioned she might be interested in having some portraits done." It was a completely fabricated conversation, but Ashley delivered it with such casual confidence that it sounded perfectly plausible. More importantly, it forced Rachel to continue the interaction when she clearly wanted to end it. "That's nice," Rachel said stiffly, clearly not sure how to respond. "Actually," I said, seizing the opportunity Ashley had created, "I was wondering if we might have a chance to catch up privately at some point tonight. It's been so long since we really talked." The request was reasonable on its surface, but I could see panic flicker in Rachel's eyes. The last thing she wanted was a private conversation with me, especially not here, tonight, surrounded by all the people she was trying to impress. "Of course," she said, because refusing would have looked strange to everyone watching. "Maybe later, when things calm down a bit." "Perfect," I replied with a smile. "I'll look forward to it." As Rachel and Derek moved away, clearly eager to put distance between us, Ashley remained at my side. I could feel her studying me with new interest, and when I met her gaze, I saw something that looked like admiration mixed with curiosity. "That was interesting," she said quietly. Which part? The part where you made it clear that you're not here to play the role they expected you to play. I smiled, realizing that Ashley was even more perceptive than I had given her credit for. She had understood immediately that my presence represented a threat to the narrative Rachel and Derek were trying to establish. Would you like to step outside for some air? I asked. I think it might be time for that honest conversation you mentioned wanting to have. Ashley nodded, and we made our way toward the terrace doors. As we walked, I caught sight of Rachel, watching us from across the room, her expression tight with concern. She was beginning to realize that her carefully planned evening wasn't going to unfold exactly as she had envisioned. The terrace was mercifully quiet, with only a few other guests taking advantage of the mild October evening. Ashley and I found a spot near the railing where we could speak privately without being overheard. So, Ashley said without preamble, what exactly are you planning to do here tonight? The directness of her question caught me off guard, but I appreciated her honesty. I'm planning to tell the truth, I said simply. About what, specifically? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would determine whether Ashley became a true ally or decided she needed to warn her sister about what was coming. About the fact that Derek and Rachel's relationship began while he was still married to me. About the lies Rachel told me for months while she was sleeping with my husband. About the real timeline of their romance, which is very different from the story they've been telling everyone. Ashley was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden beyond the terrace. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. I wondered about that, she said. The timeline never quite made sense, and Rachel got very uncomfortable whenever anyone asked too many questions about how they got together. The admission gave me hope that Ashley was ready to hear the full truth. There's more, I continued. I have reason to believe that their relationship isn't as stable as they're pretending it is. Derek has been taking mysterious phone calls. They've been having arguments at family dinners, and Rachel has been showing signs of stress that suggest all is not well in paradise. Ashley turned to look at me directly. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to help people understand what they're really celebrating tonight. Not a fairy tale romance, but a relationship built on betrayal and deception that's already showing cracks. She was quiet again, and I could see her wrestling with the implications of what I was suggesting. Finally, she met my eyes with a look of determination that reminded me powerfully of the woman Rachel used to be, before she became someone I didn't recognize. Tell me everything, Ashley said. If I'm going to help you do this, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Ashley listened without interruption as I laid out everything I had discovered over the past 8 months. The timeline of Derek and Rachel's affair, the lies Rachel had told me while pretending to be my supportive friend, the financial inconsistencies in their new lifestyle, and most importantly, the evidence I had gathered that their relationship was already fracturing under the weight of its deceptive foundation. When I finished, Ashley was quiet for several minutes, processing what she had heard. The sounds of the party drifted out to us through the terrace doors. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses. But out here in the garden, surrounded by the scent of late-blooming roses, the truth felt more real than the celebration happening inside. I knew something wasn't right, Ashley said finally. Rachel has been different for months, more controlling, more anxious about everything. And Derek. She shook her head. He tries so hard to fit in with our family, but it never feels natural. It's like he's constantly performing. What sealed it for me, I continued, was realizing that they're not just lying to everyone else, they're lying to themselves. They want so badly to believe that what they did was justified, that it was destiny or true love, that they've constructed this entire mythology around their relationship. But mythology isn't the same as reality. Ashley pulled out her phone and scrolled through some recent photos. Look at this, she said, showing me a picture from a family barbecue the previous month. See how they're positioned? They're physically close, but they're not really connecting. Rachel is looking at the camera, Derek is looking off to the side, and there's this space between them even though they're supposed to be this madly in love couple. She was right. The body language in the photo told a completely different story from the one Rachel had been posting on her own social media. These were two people who were working very hard to appear happy, rather than two people who actually were happy. There's something else, Ashley said, lowering her voice even further. Last week, Rachel asked me if I thought she was making the right decision, just out of nowhere while we were having coffee. When I asked what she meant, she backtracked and said she was talking about the venue for tonight's party, but I could tell that wasn't what she meant at all. The admission was exactly what I had been hoping to hear. If Rachel was having doubts serious enough to voice them, even obliquely to her sister, then the facade was cracking more than I had dared to hope. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that only she could know what was right for her life," Ashley replied. "But I also said that the best decisions are usually the ones you don't have to convince yourself to make." I smiled at the wisdom in that response. Ashley had given her sister permission to examine her own doubts without directly criticizing Derek or the engagement. It was the kind of gentle probing that might actually get through to someone who was deep in denial about their choices. "We should go back inside," I said, glancing toward the ballroom. "People will start to notice if we're out here too long." Ashley nodded, but before we moved toward the doors, she grabbed my arm gently. "What exactly are you planning to do? I mean, I understand why you want the truth to come out, but how are you going to make that happen without it looking like you're just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause trouble?" It was a fair question, and one I had been grappling with for weeks. The challenge wasn't just revealing the truth, it was revealing it in a way that people would believe and take seriously rather than dismissing as vindictive jealousy. "The truth has a way of revealing itself," I said carefully. "Sometimes it just needs the right circumstances to come to light. I'm not planning to stand up and make accusations. I'm planning to create opportunities for people to see what's really happening and draw their own conclusions." Ashley studied my face in the dim light from the ballroom. "You're not going to do anything that will hurt innocent people, are you?" "Because whatever Rachel has done, there are a lot of people in there who genuinely care about her." The concern in her voice was touching, and it reminded me why I had been drawn to her in the first place. Unlike her sister, Ashley seemed to navigate the world with genuine empathy and consideration for others. "I'm not interested in hurting anyone," I assured her. "I'm interested in making sure people understand what they're celebrating before they commit to supporting it. There's a difference." We made our way back into the ballroom where the party was in full swing. The dinner portion of the evening had concluded, and people were mingling more freely, moving between the bar and the small clusters of conversation that had formed throughout the room. A string quartet was playing softly in one corner, and the atmosphere felt more relaxed than it had when I first arrived. I spotted Derek near the bar, engaged in conversation with several men I recognized as his colleagues from work. Even from across the room, I could see that he looked more comfortable than he had earlier in the evening, probably relieved to be talking about neutral topics rather than fielding questions about his personal life. Rachel was on the opposite side of the room, surrounded by what appeared to be her college sorority sisters, all of whom were examining her engagement ring and listening to what I assumed was the story of Derek's proposal. She was animated and laughing, but I noticed that she kept glancing around the room as if she was keeping track of where everyone was at all times. "She's been doing that all night," Ashley observed, following my gaze. "Watching everyone, making sure conversations stay where she wants them to go. It's exhausting just watching her." Before I could respond, we were approached by Lisa Parker, my old college friend who had been diplomatically neutral when I had spoken with her weeks earlier. Lisa looked genuinely happy to see me, and her hug felt warm and uncomplicated, in a way that reminded me of simpler times. "Claire, "I'm so glad you decided to come," Lisa said. "I wasn't sure if you would, given everything that's happened." "I thought it was important to be here," I replied truthfully. "Besides, I've been curious to see how everyone is doing." Lisa glanced around the room, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "It's been interesting, watching everyone navigate this situation. People have been very careful about what they say, if you know what I mean." Ashley stepped closer to our conversation, clearly interested in hearing an outsider's perspective on the evening's dynamics. "What do you mean by careful?" Ashley asked. Lisa looked between us, seeming to assess whether she could speak freely. "I mean that everyone is trying very hard to be supportive and positive, but there are definitely some unspoken questions about how everything happened. People remember that Claire and Rachel were best friends, and that Derek and Claire seemed happy together. The timeline of when Derek and Rachel got together is, well, it raises some questions that people are too polite to ask directly." The admission was more honest than I had expected from Lisa, who had always been someone who avoided conflict and controversy. If even she was willing to acknowledge that people had questions, then the doubts were more widespread than Rachel probably realized. "What kind of questions?" I asked, genuinely curious about what people had been saying when they thought no one was listening. Lisa glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned in slightly. "Questions about whether Derek and Rachel were involved before Derek's marriage ended. Questions about whether Rachel was really being a good friend to you during that time. Questions about why everything happened so fast after the divorce was finalized." Ashley's eyebrows rose at this information. It was clear that she hadn't realized how much speculation had been circulating among the couple's mutual friends and acquaintances. "Have people been talking about this openly?" Ashley asked. "Not openly, no," Lisa replied. "But in private conversations, yes. People have been comparing notes about things they noticed or conversations they remember. It's the kind of situation where individual pieces of information don't mean much, but when you put them all together, a pattern starts to emerge." This was exactly what I had been hoping to hear. The truth was already surfacing in private conversations, among people who had known all three of us during the relevant time period. They were connecting dots and reaching conclusions without any input from me, which meant that my role could be simply to give them permission to voice what they were already thinking. "It must be difficult for you to be here tonight," Lisa continued, turning back to me. "I can't imagine how I would handle being in your position." "Actually, it's been enlightening," I said carefully. "Sometimes you don't realize how much you didn't know about a situation until you have some distance from it." The comment was deliberately ambiguous, but I could see both Lisa and Ashley processing the implication that I had learned things about my marriage and its end that I hadn't known at the time. Our conversation was interrupted by the approach of Kevin Davis, who looked like he had been working up the courage to join us for several minutes. His expression was serious, and I could tell that whatever he wanted to discuss wasn't going to be casual small talk. "Excuse me, ladies," he said politely, then turned to me specifically. "Claire, I was wondering if I could have a word with you privately." Lisa immediately excused herself, clearly sensing that this was a family matter that didn't concern her. Ashley looked like she wanted to stay, but Kevin gave her a meaningful look that suggested she should make herself scarce as well. "Of course," I said, following Kevin toward a quieter corner of the room where we could speak without being overheard. Kevin was clearly uncomfortable with whatever he felt compelled to say, and he spent several moments looking around the room before finally meeting my eyes. "I want you to know that our family appreciates you being here tonight," he began carefully. "I know this situation can't be easy for you, and the fact that you're handling it with such grace means a lot." I waited, sensing that there was more he wanted to say. "I also want you to know," he continued, "that there are some of us who have questions about how everything unfolded. Questions that we probably should have asked sooner." The admission was significant coming from Rachel's own brother, and I could see how much it cost him to voice doubts about his sister's choices. "What kind of questions?" I asked gently. Kevin looked around again, making sure we weren't being observed, then leaned in slightly. "Questions about timing, about loyalty, about whether the story we've been told is complete." He was being diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. Rachel's own family was beginning to question the narrative she had constructed about her relationship with Derek. "What made you start questioning things?" I asked. Kevin was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Honestly, it was watching Derek tonight. He's trying so hard to fit in, to be what he thinks we want him to be, that it's obvious he's not comfortable with who he actually is in this situation. And Rachel." He trailed off. "What about Rachel?" "Rachel has been different since all this started. More defensive, more controlling, more concerned about appearances than she used to be. It's like she's expending so much energy maintaining the story that she doesn't have any left for actually living her life." The observation was remarkably perceptive, and it confirmed what I had been seeing in Rachel's behavior as well. The effort required to maintain a fiction was taking a visible toll on her, even if she didn't want to admit it. "Have you talked to her about your concerns?" I asked. Kevin shook his head. "How do you ask your sister if her engagement is built on a lie? How do you question whether she betrayed her best friend without sounding like you're attacking her character?" It was a fair point, and it highlighted the impossible position that Rachel's deception had put her entire family in. They could sense that something wasn't right, but confronting it directly would require them to acknowledge that someone they loved was capable of serious betrayal. "Maybe," I suggested carefully, "the question isn't whether she's capable of betrayal, but whether she's capable of admitting when she's made a mistake." Kevin looked at me with surprise, as if the possibility of Rachel acknowledging error had never occurred to him. "You think she knows she made a mistake?" he asked. "I think she's starting to realize that getting what you want and being happy with what you got are two very different things," I replied. Before Kevin could respond, we were interrupted by a commotion near the center of the room. Derek's phone had apparently rung, and he had answered it despite being in the middle of a conversation with several guests. The call was clearly something urgent or private, because he had stepped away from the group and was speaking in hushed, tense tones. Rachel had noticed the interruption and was making her way across the room toward Derek, her expression tight, with irritation. Even from where Kevin and I stood, we could see that this was exactly the kind of behavior Ashley had described from the family dinner the week before. "This should be interesting," Kevin muttered under his breath. We watched as Rachel reached Derek and placed a hand on his arm, clearly trying to get his attention. Derek held up a finger, indicating that he needed another moment to finish his call, and Rachel's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. They were in the middle of their engagement party, surrounded by family and friends, and Derek was prioritizing a phone call over the celebration. The call continued for another minute or two, with Derek turning slightly away from Rachel as he spoke. When he finally hung up, Rachel leaned in and said something to him that we couldn't hear, but her body language made it clear that she was not pleased. Derek's response was equally inaudible, but his defensive posture suggested that he didn't appreciate being criticized for taking the call. They stood there for a moment, having what was clearly an argument in the middle of their own engagement party, trying to keep their voices low enough that the surrounding guests couldn't hear the specific words. The tension was palpable, and I noticed that conversations around them had gradually died away as people became aware of the conflict happening in their midst. This was exactly the kind of public crack in their relationship that I had been hoping might surface naturally. "Well," Kevin said quietly, "I guess that answers some questions." Ashley appeared at my other side, having watched the scene unfold from across the room. "That's the third time tonight," she whispered. "He's taken 3 phone calls during his own engagement party. The information was damning, and I could see that both Kevin and Ashley were beginning to understand that the problems in Rachel and Derek's relationship ran deeper than simple adjustment issues or wedding stress. Rachel seemed to realize that their argument was drawing attention because she suddenly smiled brightly and linked her arm through Derek's, pulling him back into circulation among their guests. But the damage was done. People had seen the conflict, and they were beginning to talk among themselves about what it might mean. I think, I said quietly to Kevin and Ashley, that people are starting to see the real relationship behind all the celebration. And indeed, as I looked around the room, I could see small clusters of guests engaged in quiet, serious conversations, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Rachel and Derek with new speculation. The truth was beginning to surface on its own, just as I had hoped it would. The evening was far from over, but the foundation of Rachel and Derek's perfect narrative was already beginning to crumble. The opportunity I had been waiting for came an hour later, when Rachel finally approached me with the smile that used to mean we were about to share secrets, but now felt like a weapon she was wielding to maintain control. She had clearly been working up the nerve to have our promised private conversation, and I could see the calculation behind her friendly demeanor. "Claire," she said warmly, though her eyes remained guarded, "I was hoping we could step out and catch up properly. It's been far too long since we really talked." I followed her through the terrace doors and into the garden, where fairy lights strung between the trees created an intimate atmosphere that would have been romantic under different circumstances. Rachel chose a spot near the fountain where the sound of running water would mask our conversation from any potential eavesdroppers. "I have to say," Rachel began, settling onto a stone bench and patting the space beside her, "you look incredible tonight. Divorce clearly agrees with you." The comment was designed to sound like a compliment, but I could hear the subtle probe underneath it. She was testing to see how I would respond to references to my failed marriage, whether I would become defensive or emotional in a way she could exploit. "Thank you," I replied simply, taking a seat but maintaining some distance between us. "I've learned a lot about myself over the past few months." "I'm so glad to hear that," Rachel said, and for a moment her expression seemed genuinely warm. "I've been worried about you, you know. I wanted to reach out so many times, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me given the circumstances." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that I almost admired the skill involved. She had perfected the art of rewriting history to cast herself as the considerate friend who had only stayed away out of respect for my feelings. "The circumstances," I repeated thoughtfully. "You mean the fact that you were sleeping with my husband while pretending to be my friend and confidant?" Rachel's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of genuine emotion crossing her face before she regained control. "Claire, I know how it must look, but it wasn't like that. What happened between Derek and me, it wasn't planned. It just happened." "For how long?" I asked calmly. "What do you mean?" "How long were you sleeping with my husband while listening to me complain about how distant he'd become? How long were you offering me advice about my marriage while actively destroying it?" Rachel's hands twisted in her lap, and I could see her struggling to find a version of the truth that wouldn't make her look completely heartless. "It was only a few weeks before Derek told you about us, and we both felt terrible about it. We tried to fight it, but sometimes you can't help who you fall in love with." The explanation was so perfectly rehearsed that I wondered how many times she had practiced it in front of a mirror. Every word was chosen to minimize her culpability while maximizing the romantic mythology she had constructed around their affair. "A few weeks," I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. "So when you came over that Tuesday night, in March to help me plan Derek's surprise birthday party, you had already been sleeping with him." Rachel's face went pale as she realized I was testing her story against specific memories. "Claire, when you helped me pick out that expensive watch for his birthday, the one he said he loved so much, you already knew he was planning to leave me." "It wasn't like that," Rachel said desperately. We weren't planning anything. We were both confused and guilty and trying to figure out what to do. And when you held my hand while I cried about how disconnected Derek and I had become, when you told me that all marriages go through rough patches and that I just needed to be patient with him, you were sleeping in my bed the nights I worked late. Each accusation hit its mark, and I could see Rachel's carefully constructed narrative crumbling under the weight of specific, undeniable facts. She had spent so much energy convincing herself that what she had done was forgivable, that she had lost sight of how it would sound when laid out clearly and chronologically. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered, and for the first time that evening, she sounded like the friend I used to know, rather than the polished stranger she had become. But it did happen, I said firmly. And now you're asking everyone we know to celebrate it as if it's some beautiful love story, instead of acknowledging what it actually was. A betrayal that destroyed multiple relationships and hurt people who trusted both of you. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fountain as if it might provide her with answers she couldn't find on her own. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. What do you want from me, Claire? Do you want me to confess to everyone in there that I'm a terrible person? Do you want me to call off my engagement and spend the rest of my life making amends for hurting you? What would be enough? The questions revealed more than Rachel probably intended. They showed that she understood the magnitude of what she had done, even if she had been trying to minimize it publicly. They also showed that she was exhausted from maintaining the facade of innocent love conquering all. I don't want you to destroy your life, I said truthfully. But I do want you to stop asking people to celebrate a relationship built on lies. I want you to acknowledge that choices have consequences, and that the foundation you've built this engagement on isn't as solid as you're pretending it is. What do you mean? Rachel asked, though I could see in her eyes that she already knew. I mean that Derek is taking mysterious phone calls during your engagement party. I mean that you've been having public arguments about his priorities and his commitment to your relationship. I mean that even your own family is starting to question whether this engagement is really what either of you wants, or just what you think you're supposed to want. Rachel's composure finally cracked completely, and tears began rolling down her cheeks, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I don't know what I'm doing, she admitted. I thought if we could just get through tonight, if everyone could see how happy we are, then it would all feel real. But nothing feels real anymore. The admission was more honest than anything she had said to me in over a year, and I felt a flicker of the compassion I used to have for her. This was the woman who had been my best friend for over a decade, and seeing her so lost and confused reminded me of why I had cared about her in the first place. Rachel, I said gently, when was the last time you and Derek had a conversation? About something other than wedding planning or damage control? When was the last time you felt like you were with someone who actually knew you rather than someone who was performing the role of your fiancé? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in her foundation. I can't remember, she whispered. That's not what a healthy relationship feels like, I told her. That's what a performance feels like, and performances are exhausting to maintain. Rachel looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. But if I admit that this was all a mistake, then I have to face the fact that I destroyed our friendship for nothing. I have to acknowledge that I hurt you and Derek and myself for a relationship that was never going to work. Maybe, I said carefully, the question isn't whether you made a mistake, but whether you're brave enough to stop making it worse. Before Rachel could respond, we heard voices approaching from the direction of the terrace. Derek appeared, followed by Ashley and Kevin, all of them looking concerned and slightly out of breath. There you are, Derek said, relief evident in his voice. People were starting to ask where you'd gone. He stopped short when he saw Rachel's tear-streaked face, and his expression shifted from relief to alarm. What's wrong? What happened? Ashley and Kevin hung back slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the obvious emotional intensity of whatever conversation they had interrupted. "Nothing's wrong," Rachel said quickly, attempting to compose herself. "Claire and I were just catching up." Derek looked between us suspiciously, clearly not buying the explanation. "It looks like more than catching up," he said, his voice taking on a protective edge that would have been touching if it hadn't been so misplaced. "Actually," I said, standing up from the bench, "Rachel and I were having a long overdue honest conversation about the past, about choices and consequences, and what it means to build something real instead of something that just looks good from the outside." Derek's face darkened as he processed the implications of my words. "I think this conversation is over," he said firmly. "Is it?" I asked, looking directly at Rachel. "Because I think Rachel might have more to say." Rachel looked between Derek and me, clearly torn between the safety of retreating back into their established narrative and the relief of finally acknowledging the truth that had been weighing on her for months. "Rachel," Derek said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "we should go back inside. People are waiting for us." But Rachel didn't move. Instead, she looked at Ashley and Kevin, her own family members who had been watching this entire situation unfold with growing concern. "Ashley," she said quietly, "you asked me last week if I was making the right decision. Do you remember?" Ashley nodded, stepping closer to her sister. "I remember. I told you I was talking about the venue for tonight, but that wasn't true." Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet garden, every word carried, clearly. "I was talking about all of it, the engagement, the wedding, the whole relationship." Derek stepped forward, alarm replacing his earlier protectiveness. "Rachel, what are you saying?" Rachel looked up at him with an expression that was both sad and relieved. "I'm saying that Claire is right. We've been performing this relationship instead of living it, and I'm exhausted from pretending that what we did to get here was justified by how we feel about each other now." "That's not true," Derek said desperately. "We love each other. What we have is real." "Do we?" Rachel asked, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. "Derek, when was the last time we talked about anything that mattered? When was the last time you looked at me and saw someone you wanted to spend your life with instead of someone you felt obligated to marry because of what we did?" Derek opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly unable to come up with an answer that would sound convincing. "And when was the last time," Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger, "that you didn't take a phone call from whoever keeps calling you during family dinners and parties and important moments in our relationship?" The question hit its target, and Derek's face flushed with guilt and anger. "That's completely different. That has nothing to do with us." "It has everything to do with us," Rachel said, standing up from the bench to face him directly. "Because if you can't prioritize our relationship during our own engagement party, how are you going to prioritize it during a marriage?" Kevin stepped forward, clearly feeling the need to intervene before the situation escalated further. "Maybe we should all take a breath and—" "No," Rachel interrupted, turning to look at her brother and sister. "I need to say this. I need to finally be honest about what happened and what's been happening ever since." She turned back to Derek, who was staring at her with an expression of dawning panic. "Claire didn't do anything to us tonight except give me permission to admit what I've been feeling for months." "This isn't working, Derek. We're not working. We're two people who made a terrible mistake and then compounded it by trying to turn it into something beautiful instead of acknowledging what it actually was." "Rachel, please," Derek said, his voice breaking. "Don't do this here. Don't do this now." "When else am I going to do it?" she asked. "After we've put everyone we know through the expense and emotional investment of a wedding? After we've spent years making each other miserable while trying to prove that we were right to hurt people for this relationship?" Derek looked around, the group desperately, as if someone might come to his rescue, but Ashley and Kevin were watching their sister with something that looked like respect mixed with relief. They had been waiting for her to acknowledge what they had all been seeing. "The phone calls," Rachel said, her voice steadying as she found her courage. "Who have you been talking to, Derek? Because it's clearly someone more important to you than I am." Derek's silence was answer enough, and I saw Rachel's last illusions about their relationship crumble in real time. "I think," she said finally, reaching for the engagement ring on her finger, "that we've put everyone through enough tonight." Derek watched in horror as she slipped the ring off her finger and held it out to him. "Rachel, don't do this. We can work through whatever problems we're having. We just need time to—" "We've had 8 months," Rachel said firmly. 8 months to build something real, and instead we've spent that time building a performance. I'm tired of performing, Derek. I'm tired of pretending that what we did was justified, and that what we have now is worth all the damage we caused." She pressed the ring into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I'm sorry to you, I'm sorry to Claire, and I'm sorry to everyone who believed in us when we didn't even believe in ourselves." Derek stood there holding the ring, looking lost and bewildered, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. Around us, the sounds of the party continued, oblivious to the fact that the engagement they were celebrating had just ended. "What am I supposed to tell everyone?" Derek asked helplessly. Rachel looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the way a relationship begins. Tell them that we realized we were better at being each other's mistake than each other's future." Ashley stepped forward and put her arm around Rachel's shoulders, offering the support that Derek no longer could. Kevin looked like he wanted to say something to Derek, but seemed to realize that there were no words that could make this situation less devastating. I watched as Derek walked slowly back toward the terrace doors, still clutching the engagement ring and probably trying to figure out how to explain to a room full of guests that the party was over. Rachel watched him go with an expression that was sad but also relieved, as if she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying for too long. "Are you okay?" Ashley asked her sister gently. Rachel nodded, though tears were still flowing down her cheeks. "I think I will be," she said. "For the first time in months, I think I actually will be." She turned to me, and I could see the woman I used to know looking back at me from behind the ruins of the person she had tried to become. "Claire," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I know I can't undo what I did to you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that ending this engagement doesn't erase the fact that I betrayed our friendship in the worst possible way. I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been my closest friend for over a decade before becoming the source of my greatest heartbreak. The anger I had carried for 8 months was still there, but it was no longer the driving force in my chest. "I hope you figure out who you want to be," I said finally. "Because the Rachel I used to know would never have done what you did. And the Rachel standing here tonight finally seems to understand that." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement that people could change, that mistakes could be learning experiences, and that sometimes the most important conversations happened when the performance finally stopped, and the truth was allowed to surface. As we made our way back toward the ballroom, I realized that the evening had ended exactly as it should have, not with revenge or public humiliation, but with honesty. Rachel would have to face the consequences of her choices, Derek would have to figure out what he actually wanted from his life, and I would go home knowing that the truth had finally been told. The party was effectively over, though it took another hour for all the guests to understand what had happened and make their graceful exits. By the time I left Riverside Manor, the fairy lights in the garden were the only illumination remaining, casting shadows over the scene of what should have been a celebration, but had become something much more valuable, a moment of truth that had been 8 months in the making. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.